I am very happy to have Pastor Brannon with us today from Bayside Church, Folsom. Would you give him a hand today as he comes forward? Go get him, buddy.
Love you, brother. North County, good morning. It is so good to be back. I say this with all the sincerity that my heart can muster. I have missed this place. It's been a couple of months and I've missed it. I've missed you all. I've missed connecting with you in the lobby. I'm grateful we have things like social media to connect online. But honestly, Linden now kind of feels like a second home to me. It feels like I told a member recently, even this morning, that when I pulled in just a couple days ago, I felt like I could breathe again. So it's always worth me saying that I love you. I love this church. I'm always really honored to have the opportunity to share here, to get to play a small, little bitty, microscopic part of what God is doing here is something that I treasure, and that our hearts as a church and as people beat kind of the same way. So again, the privilege is mine. Thank you for having me. I love you. Bye. All right, here we go. I was in Iraq and Lebanon in 2017. Not as a military serviceman, but somebody that had been asked by a couple of different organizations to join this trip that was based on humanitarian aid and then a little bit of above ground and a little bit of underground church support. So we flew into Kurd-occupied Erbil as we made our way right outside of Mosul. Now, if you're putting together the timeline, you know that wasn't the best time to be right outside of Mosul. I'm right outside of there, and ISIS still had the west side of the city. One morning, we were crossing through many checkpoints as our caravan was moving through, and we arrived at one of the checkpoints, and it had clearly, no shadow of a doubt from the look and the smell, had been bombed. And it looked like it had been bombed very recently. I come to find out as we pulled up to the checkpoint, it had been bombed 12 days earlier. So tension sat in the air, just like it does as I tell you now. That nobody has any idea what to do in that moment. You're praying and yet you're anxiously anticipating what may come. And I remember pulling up to this checkpoint and the driver handing out the window his driver's license, his ID. See, in Iraq though, your ID has your religion on it. So depending on who gets your ID, changes how you're going to be treated. He hands his ID out the window, and it has this small insignia identifying that he is a follower of the way, the follower of the Nazarene named Jesus. And the military officer standing underneath a burnt checkpoint that had been bombed said in Arabic, then translated to us by the national leader that was with us, that the guard had said, "Let them pass. They are people of peace." He didn't pull us out of the van. He didn't check all of us. He saw that a cross was on a man's ID and let us go. Something in me changed that day. There was something about that moment in that place that everything around me was the antithesis of peace, and yet Christians were known for it. Christians were known for it. But that wasn't the last moment on that trip where my world was rocked by the way that Christians lived amidst adversity. In Iraq, we served in a little village called Kirkush, right outside of Mosul. I'll get more to that later. But that village 6 months before had 75,000 in population and now had 0. Except for those who had come back and started to rebuild. We served in the surrounding villages where people had ran and were internally displaced. We helped churches come up with strategies and operating in the place and space in which they were. And then we made our way into Lebanon through an airport held by another group of people that you don't want beef with. And we make our way into the Bekaa Valley where David mentioned twice in the Psalms, which were the homes of refugees who had fled after Assad's chemical attack in Idlib, if you remember that spring. So there we were. And we walked into a church that was serving that space. And they introduced me to a man. I think we got a picture of his back and the back of his head on the screen. If you look on the right, that's me. If you look on the left, that's my buddy Stephen Park. Stephen is a missionary in Spain. And in the middle is a guy named Amjad. You see, Amjad had been an ISIS soldier. Actual ISIS. And to come into Lebanon with his guns on him, going into the church that they had heard was meeting on a certain side of the city with the mission to kill the pastor we were partnering with. And he had come over, and this was before we had been there, and he had come to cross, and he sat in the back of the room as the pastor preached with his guns on him, waiting for the right opportunity to take the man's life. And then he walks to the front at the end of the sermon, takes out his guns, lays them on the altar, and puts his faith in Jesus. Something that many believed was impossible. And I got tears in my eyes when he's telling me this story. He'd only been a believer like 7 months when I met him. And I asked him, I was like, Amjad, what was it about that day and about that message that God used to bring your heart to him? And Amjad looked at me and said, the pastor's sermon that night was on something I've never heard in my life. And I said, Jesus? And he goes, no, I knew about Jesus. I had never heard somebody preach that you should love your enemies. And I realized in that moment, Amjad said, that if there was love so strong that it could make you love your enemies, then it had to be the true love. So I laid my guns down and surrendered my heart to Jesus. And I wonder if sometimes if we're in church a long time, if we forget how radical Jesus is. If we forget how radical the implication is that you and me could be so changed, that a heart of stone could be made so much a heart of flesh, that we could become so enraptured with love that we could live into the way of the kingdom, so much so as to love our enemies and to pray for them and even bless them, that somehow grace and mercy and compassion and love could transcend by the Spirit of God and be displayed to the world through us. That Jesus' gospel, if you ask my friend Amjad, was so good, it was either too good to be true or it was worth every step he was ever going to take from that point forward. Have we, though, forgot that at times? Last weekend, you heard a wonderful sermon on a sermon held within Jesus' most famous sermon he ever spoke, which was the Sermon on the Mount. And in that particular part of the message that Luke walked through last week, Jesus is going on a full-scale raid of this upside-down kingdom declaration of Jesus' way. He looks at a crowd on a hillside one day and says, you are meant to be salt and light, meaning salt makes things better, light makes things brighter. Now you know your mission in the world. You go be salt and light. I'm the fulfillment, Jesus, of the law. You said murder was bad. I'm telling you, if you hated, you've already murdered. You thought adultery was something you shouldn't have done. I'm telling you all the way down to the lust in your heart. That the world lives eye for an eye and you should not, and you should turn the other cheek. And then he doubles down on what changed my friend Amjad's life, and I'd love to read it to you today. He looked at the crowd and said, you have heard it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. He causes the sun to rise on evil and the good and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. If you love those who love you, what reward do you get? Are not even the tax collectors doing that? And if you greet only your own people, what are you doing more than others? Do not even pagans do that? Be perfect, therefore, as your Father is perfect. North County? That's a tough way to end a sentence from Jesus. Just be perfect. That's a lot. We'll see you here next week. Don't fret, my friends. We're going to moonwalk this sucker backwards like Michael Jackson did in the 93 Super Bowl. If you're with me, let me hear you say, let's go. Notice how Jesus starts. I'd write it down in your notes if you're a note taker. I'd get it tattooed across your forehead if you're a tattoo person. But here's how he starts. You have heard it said. You have heard that it was said. And he says that twice in just this couple verses in the Sermon on the Mount. I've had the privilege and honor of teaching New Testament theology at the collegiate level for the last 4 years. And the assertion I make the first day of class as all of these students come in hungry and wide-eyed and excited is simply this, that all of us have pieces of our belief system, our theology, and our thoughts about God that are more about our background than they are the Bible. All of us. All of us have some beliefs that's a little bit more where you came from than it is God. There's a little more culture than it is cross, which is tough because that phrase asserts, Jesus asserts to these people on a hillside that what they've been taught at times by their cultures and at times by their own religious leaders are at worst full on wrong and at best at times half pictures being misused. My parents and my grandparents are from deep Appalachia, if you couldn't tell. My grandparents' creekside property had an outhouse. My grandmother on the other side of the family, on my mom's side, had a rotary phone and had a butter churn in every room. And I'm the only person in this room in Linden, Washington that has ever heard the following sentence. Brannon, go in that ice box and get us some vittles, maters, and taters. I swear that's the best sweet milk I ever had. That Wander Man lives up the holler a road of pieces to crows flies down by the creek. You got to get the gumption to grab the wheelbarrow and ask the man upstairs to give you a lick and a promise. Go grab a buggy for your kinfolk, dadgummit. Bless your heart. Hush up now. I'm fixing to catch some crawdads with Tom, your second cousin, once removed, who I ain't seen since he was knee-high from a grasshopper. I'm the only one in here that knows what that means. But I tell you, in that place where they grew up, they were taught all the time you could lose your salvation by church leaders. It didn't matter. Church leaders told them they were losing their salvation every time that they messed up, that they were in and out of grace. It didn't matter if the Bible said that nothing could ever pluck you from his hand. It didn't matter. Culture had taught them otherwise. My grandmother talks about this a lot, that she had heard it said that if they used anything other than the King James Bible, they were literally going to die and go to hell, depending on the translation. That had nothing to do with the Bible. Paul didn't have a King James Bible, believe it or not. Jesus didn't read from the King James either, believe it or not. It didn't matter if it was biblical, it mattered that it was background. And I want to acknowledge those lighthearted examples so that we can then introspectively look at the deeper pieces. There are things, and I'm not saying it was Kurt, I'm not saying who it was, it could have been your mom, could have been your dad, could have been where you came from. I'm merely saying there are things we have all heard that if Jesus was looking us in the face, he would say, yeah, you heard it said, but... See, the first thing, if we're ever going to be a people that get to enemy love, point number one, we have to be a people willing to challenge our assumptions. They have to look biblically at our foregone conclusions and look at the assumption that Jesus is challenging that day. You've heard it said, love your neighbor, but hate your enemies. And friends, let's hold the real honest tension. That is a narrative alive and well in our land. It's a narrative held in our land from certain pulpits. That you can love your neighbor, but it's okay to somehow hate people that disagree with you or they're your enemies, both in society and our religious orders. Jesus is correcting them and then vicariously us from that. The question is not who is your neighbor. You can't loophole Jesus. There were people that tried that one day in Luke chapter 10, and he gave them the parable of the Good Samaritan where he says, your neighbor is anyone that you can see, anybody you walk up on. Remember, as the great Corrie ten Boom said it, who herself had survived the horrors of a Nazi concentration camp, who had lost her family there, and yet went on to preach forgiveness and reconciliation around the world. Her quote was this: you never so touch the ocean of God's love as when you forgive and love your enemies. You want to swim in the depths of who God is? You have to choose to love and forgive your enemies. And she wasn't speaking in theory. I just told you part of her story. She was speaking from the deepest embodied, incarnational, lived reality. Which reminds us this point too. We don't have to just challenge our assumptions. If we're going to ever be people who have enemy love, we must be willing to forgive. Which is hard, because I'm going to get in somebody's business right now. Some of you in here, you feed off unforgiveness. And do you know how I know that? Because I do. And I have. That unforgiveness almost is something that feels like it's fueling us to prove people wrong, to show them what they said was inaccurate of us, that they wounded us, so if we do this, it'll actually, even though we ain't even got to say anything, wound them back. I've lived that way, pretending it was fueling us, and I'm telling you, it's killing us. It's sucking the life out of our soul. Let me be vulnerable with you for a minute. I'm somebody who's been assaulted in more ways than one. I've had to process my own trauma. I've been deeply wounded by people I loved and trusted. I know in my soul the temptation to let proving them wrong, succeeding so that they can't say anything to me, that holding this grudge deep down, unaware of how much life it's choking out of me until you're willing to let it go. Some of you know that I do a little hip hop. I wrote for a long time. I've done 3 studio albums as an artist, and now looking at this crowd, acknowledging that Linden is probably the epicenter of hip hop culture from viewpoint only. I wrote a lyric a few years ago where I was talking about yellow Lay's chips on your shoulders. I said, there's yellow Lay's on my shoulders. And I thought for sure I'd get rid of them when I got older, but come to find out, the older I got, they ain't feel like chips, they feel like they're boulders. And it's true. The longer you hold on to them, the heavier this stuff is. You know, we've got some crazy kids in our church back in Folsom, because I've told some of you the stories of them. The first time I was here, I told you about a little girl that was praying in our kids' ministry and said, God, church was great today. Wish you could have been there. So maybe we're not getting everything right that we're teaching these kids, you know? But we're trying. We got a little boy that said the Lord's Prayer once publicly and said, Lord, forgive us of our trash passes as we forgive those who pass trash against us. Our kids are crazy over there, but I had a kid show up 2 weeks ago in our lobby wearing a Darth Vader costume. And I'm thinking, great, here we are, a city on a hill, an outpost of light in the world, and the guy representing the Lord of Darkness is walking in. So this kid walks in, his name's Finn. And I said, Finn, why are you dressed up as Darth Vader? And he said, I love Darth Vader. And I said, why do you love Darth Vader? And he looked me in the face. He's like 7 years old. And he goes, well, he's the most relatable. And I thought for a second, wait, Anakin feeds on anger, betrayal, and bitterness while keeping himself masked up in order to hide his scars. You know what? Maybe he is the most relatable. Maybe he is the most like us. One of my favorite places in the Bible that talks about forgiveness is in Joseph's story in Genesis 50. His brothers have sold him into slavery, friends. Slavery. Hold the weight, his brothers. He ends up in prison, falsely accused, all because of where the epicenter of the story started was betrayal. And we get to years later in his life, and his brother send him a message from his father, and it says, your father gave this command before he died. Say to Joseph, please forgive the transgression of your brothers and their sin because they did evil to you. And now please forgive the transgression of the servants of God, the God of your father. And Joseph wept when they spoke to him. North County, forgiveness does not mean we excuse. Forgiveness doesn't mean that we pretend that the brothers in this story or the people in ours have done nothing wrong. There's an acknowledgement here. There's an asking for forgiveness. There's an acknowledgement of transgressions and evil. And Joseph is years removed, still weeping, like many of us are from our own pain. That's why it's not okay to say, well, it's okay, it'll be okay eventually. That's not forgiveness. That is sweeping dirt under a rug, and those aren't the same things. That only leads, when you sweep it under the rug, it only leads to more bitterness and more resentment. Choosing to forgive is hard work. And it's why in the church we often teach it wrongly. We often teach it like, say, I forgive you, like somehow that was enough. Or like 3 days later, you're not mad again. Forgiveness looks much more like a process and dots all over the map than a one-point pinpointed spot. That's not, I forgive you once. I'm probably going to have to turn around and forgive you again tomorrow and release it. What forgiveness is not is ever justifying someone's action, letting people off the hook, guaranteeing they get the same place in your life. None of that. Choosing to forgive, friends, is the choice to release people from the jail cell of your own resentment. From holding them inside of you with internal grudges. That you and I would be so free and fueled by love and so enraptured by it that we could throw the chips on our shoulders onto Jesus and say, I forgive them, Lord, and help me to forgive them again when I want to pick it back up. I've wept like Jesus over friends and family. Some of you are in here right now and there's somebody in your mind, and I'm begging you, not as a pastor, not as a position, not as a stage, as a person, as a brother in Christ, I'm begging you to forgive that person because it is worth it. It's worth it not only for the display of the kingdom, it's worth it for you. It will not be worth growing old and gray and becoming hard-hearted, bitter, and cold because you lived a life where you couldn't forgive those who hurt you. That doesn't mean it won't be harder than the hot place. It will. But it's worth it. If we're ever to get to enemy love, it'll be because we chose forgiveness along the way. It was Miroslav Volf, a leading academic and expert in forgiveness, who said it like this: if we view forgiveness as an obligation, that is a sort of prison. Seeing and experiencing forgiveness as a gift is what frees us from captivity to the past and opens up new possibilities for the future. Hear me today, friends. Forgiveness is about freedom. And I don't know about you, but I need me some. So it's worth it. So let's recap a little bit. You can only love your enemies if you're willing to challenge your assumptions. And then listen to the progression Jesus gives them. But not just challenge your assumptions from a cerebral spot, then to forgive your enemies. And then he takes it another step. Point number 3, be willing to pray for those who hurt us. As simply as I can say it today, it's just hard to hate people that you pray for. And Jesus knows it. And it's why many of us, myself included, when we're wounded, don't pray for people. Because we know we're going to end up like Jonah sitting under a tree somewhere saying, God, I knew you would do this compassion crap again. I knew you would try to change my heart and see it from multiple perspectives and hold the kingdom ethic. Forget that. It's how we feel internally. Because if you choose to intercede in the throne room of God, present with him and him present with you on behalf of somebody else, you ain't going to be able to keep the same heart while you do it. My mentor calls that cross-shaped enemy love. And it's interesting that Jesus looks at them and says, and if you'll do that, then you will be children of your Father in heaven. Do not get it mistaken. He is not saying that you have to earn your salvation. We just have to be good students of the word. Jesus is using a phrase here that he's used already in this sermon, marrying the two ideas together in ways that you just can't miss. Remember chapter 5 and verse 9. Jesus looked at them and said, blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Simply put, there's no divorcing this. That Jesus for all of time is tying together the ethic that peacemaking and enemy love are hand in hand. And it declares that those who are bold enough to be peacemaking enemy lovers would be seen as the world like, man, those must be God's kids. If they're going to do that, they must be God's kids. Point number 4 is we have to be those willing to make peace. Willing to make it. And I say willing on purpose because you've seen the progression. Challenge your assumptions. Forgive those. Pray for them. And then make peace. He takes us deeper and deeper into who God is and what he's done for us by challenging us to do the same. Remember what Paul told the Romans. He said, if it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace. Meaning, some of you are going to do your due diligence to live at peace and it's not going to work. because somebody else isn't going to do their due diligence to make it work. That's not the point. Their response is never our responsibility. Our responsibility is faithfulness. So you don't get to control what everybody else does in these hard, intense moments. It won't always be possible. It is just always possible for you and me, as far as it depends on us to go about making peace. I think there's only 3 types of people when it comes to peace. You remember the Good Samaritan parable. There's a couple of people that show up, rob, attack, and beat this man and leave him almost dead on the side of the road. We call those peace breakers. Peace breakers whose motto in life is me at all cost. But then a religious dude and a couple others walk by, see him bleeding on the side of the road, wearing their beautiful little pastor garments. See him there, go to the other side and leave him. Now they've taught the Old Testament, they taught the Torah to the people, and they leave a man beaten on the side of the road that they're othering because their culture is more important than their Bibles and their background shows. So they walk away. Those aren't peace breakers. Those are peace fakers. You know what the problem with people who like to fake it is? You don't know they're fake until you need them not to be. Which makes them hecka dangerous. But you don't know. And we've all broken peace. We don't all necessarily fake peace, but we all in this room can be in that third group. In the Good Samaritan, the person that comes and binds wounds and heals something that's broken, those are the peacemakers whose motto is relationship at all costs. You see the progression. And then Jesus drives that home with that phrase after he gives a couple phrases about, don't even the pagans do this? Don't the tax collectors do this? It's not about your love being convenient. It's not just about loving people that love you. It's about deeper than this. And if you do that, then hear me, verse 48, be perfect, therefore as your heavenly Father is perfect. Which is a mic drop because we all fail. And we all fail at this. And if we can own the fact that we fail at it, then it's good news. You're like, Brannon, how is it good news? Because remember what Romans 3 said, that righteousness is given through faith in Jesus Christ to all who believe. That there's no difference between Jew and Gentile, for all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, and all are justified freely by what? By his grace, through the redemption that came by Christ Jesus. That God presented Christ as a sacrifice of atonement through the shedding of his blood to be received by faith. He did this to demonstrate his righteousness, because in his forbearance he had left the sins committed beforehand unpunished. But he did it to demonstrate his righteousness at the present time, so as to be just and the one who justifies those through faith in Jesus. Friends, you know how you live perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect? You're hidden in Christ who was perfect. That it was only through faith in Jesus, and then point finally number 5, and I want to invite the band back up, that then we live in the way of Jesus. We live in this way, that Jesus would perfectly do what he calls us to. Everything we've just said, he has called us to because he's done. Remember, Jesus is the one that's turned the other cheek. Jesus has been stripped of his clothes. Jesus has carried his cross. Jesus so loved the world that he gave himself. Love that goes beyond his friends, but to while we were still enemies, us. That Willard said it like this, that when we walk in this way, we heartily join his cosmic conspiracy to overcome evil with good. There is no better weekend in the world than to read a passage and be reminded of an ethic of Jesus, that we are called to love our enemies and to pray for them and to forgive them and to make peace as far as it depends on us and live into the way of Jesus. Friends, I hate to break it to you. The world doesn't need another angry crowd. It doesn't need another ununified church. It doesn't need another bitter voice. It needs people who look like Jesus. Can I flash back to Iraq? In 2017, I'm in Karakosh, that little village I told you that we went back to, where ISIS had burned a 7th century library to the ground. And in that library was the records of the citizens there, because they're not on electronic. And I got down on my knees in the floor of that library and said, why? Why would they burn the library and the records? And an Iraqi man looked at me and said it like this: because ISIS knows if they can get people to forget who they are, they'll be whoever they're told to be. Friends, don't forget who you are and then thus be whoever the world tells you to be. Whatever camp you sit in tells you to be. Do not forget who you are. You are not just another voice in the noise. You are children of a Father in heaven. You are people of forgiveness in a world of grudges. You're people of prayer in a world of pride. You're people of peace in a world of war. You're people of such radical love that you would even love those who were discipled by and enactors of hate. This is who you are. This is who Jesus made us to be. And our call is to go live in his way, loving our enemies, unfiltered. Would you stand with me today as we sing this song in response?